Welcome to the Just Third Way podcast, where we ask the question, would you rather own or be owned? Brought to you by the Center for Economic and Social Justice at cesj.org. Hello, thanks for tuning in. Today we have another presentation from the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Jubilee Summit. Today is a recording of the webinar from Dr. Ralph Hall and Dr. Robert Ashford called Inclusive Capitalism, the Ownership-Broadening Road to Shared Prosperity and Sustainable Growth. And I wanted to say that we should have this available as a video at some point. Some of you might be on the email list and you can see it through a link in the email, but I'm sure it'll be on YouTube at some point. It will be very helpful to watch the video because they have some excellent charts and graphics. But for those of you who, are like me and have times at work where you can listen to things, but maybe while you're working or exercising, you're not able to look at the video, this is another way to get some of this information. Also, just a note, I misnamed the podcast last week, so there's two number 16s, but that was 17, so this one is 18. So anyway, thank you again, and here is Dr. Hall and Ashford.
Hi everybody, welcome to webinar number 6 of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Jubilee Summit. Today, Professor Robert Ashford and I will be talking about our ideas related to inclusive capitalism. Professor Ashford is a distinguished professor at Syracuse University, and he's located in the College of Law there. Myself, I'm here as associate professor here in the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech. And what we'll do today is we will go through two presentations. And I'll share my screen in a moment. After we finish both the presentations, what we will do is have a Q&A session. And if you have questions, take a note of those. There's a Q&A option on this webinar system, and you can also raise your hand in the system, so you can ask questions at that point. So we'll have two presentations followed by Q&A. So without further ado, I will share my screen and we will start the proceedings. So hopefully you can see my screen now, and what we'll do is turn off the video and Robert's mic, and we will begin. So what I'm going to start with here is a presentation that really talks through my role in coming to the idea of binary economics. And so this is what I'm going to focus on. I'm just making sure, yes, here we go. So over the past sort of 20 years, I've spent a significant amount of time focusing on this idea of how do we transform the industrial state. And this work has been sort of captured by a work that I did with Professor Nicholas Ashford up at MIT. And this book is about a 500,000 word text on this notion of technology, globalization, and sustainable development. And what we did in this work is cover the sort of multi-dimensional concept of sustainability. We looked at economic development, globalization, and sustainable development, how that comes together. We looked at industrial policy and the role of the firm in pursuing sustainable development, and then elevated to the national and regional level and looked at international efforts to advance environmental protection and the protection of workers through health and safety regimes. And then we moved to international trade and finance. How do you finance development? And sort of stepped back and then looked at how do we pull all of this together. And so this was a major sort of piece of work, and in the last several years we've now worked on the revised edition which has a significant rewrite in, I would say, at least a half of the work, specifically on economics, because a lot has changed in the last 5-10 years following the financial crisis. Now, three focus areas of this work are the environment, the economy, and employment. And employment, we put here specifically, replaces society, which is normally put in this quadrant. I'm very interested in how can we create meaningful, well-paid employment for workers. And then, which is the subject of today, there's the employment of the capital you own. And I will let Robert talk about these dimensions in his presentation. But another way to look at these three components is these are the levers, the mechanisms through which change can occur. So there's laws and strategies to advance each of these areas. When you think about society, it's sort of a nebulous concept, whereas employment is very specific. And it's increasingly important given some of the problems we are facing. And that's what these two ice hockey stick curves will hopefully reveal. I tried to find a way to simply explain what is potentially a very complex challenge that we face as a society on this planet. Now, the first curve relates to departures in temperature from the 1961 to 1990 average temperatures. And, those of you familiar with the Paris Agreement, you will know that we're trying to keep the temperature increase below 2 degrees. On here you only see half a degree up, but it could go another 1.5 degrees. So there's some major environmental concerns that we need to keep our eye on and address. Now, this is climate change. We could talk about plastics, which are now accumulating in the oceans. You could probably draw a similar ice hockey stick curve for that. We now have some fire-retardant killer whales in the oceans where they've accumulated the polybrominated diphenyl ethers, which are moving up the supply chain into the killer whales. So they now have sufficient quantities of that chemical, fire-retardant chemical, to be fire retardant, which is very problematic. So it's not just one issue. There are multiple environmental challenges we're concerned about. Then there's now increasing concern in the distribution of income and income inequality. This is a snapshot of U.S. income, the U.S. income distribution, and you can see this again, this kind of ice hockey stick curve, where a significant proportion of the population has a limited amount of income, whereas wealth is highly concentrated off to the right. So what I plan to do in the next sequence of slides is really try to unpack this, look at some of the trends over the past 40 years, and highlight what I'm very concerned about in terms of these dual problems of how do we address environmental issues and address income inequality. And I'll come back to that. So here's a really interesting graph that shows how labor productivity and real GDP per capita has been increasing since the 1950s. But at around about 1970, you can see how median family income broke away from labor productivity and GDP. And so what people talk about now is we have this decoupling where productivity and GDP are increasing, but job prospects and income are leveling out. And so the wealth that's being created is being concentrated, right? So if you're not getting an income or a growing income from your wages, that the wealth that's being created from this growth in productivity and GDP is being concentrated in the hands of those that own the capital. And we'll come back to this idea in different ways today. Over the same time period, you can look at different kinds of data. So here, if you look at the blue line, we've got wages as a percent of GDP, and the top line is corporate profits as a percent of GDP. So what you see is a very slow decline in wages as a percent of GDP up until about the year 2000, where it drops off on this downward trend. And so we'll see how low this goes. But now we've gone at least more or less 10% decline in that period, which is very significant. As the share of GDP going to wages declines, what you see is a corresponding increase in the profits going to corporations. And just note how fast the corporations rebounded following the financial crisis. Is now back to the trend. So when sort of asking questions as to what's going on here, you have these trends occurring not just in the US. The same source here talks about the labor share of GDP declining in 42 out of 59 industrialized countries. People point to trade and financial openness, automation, labor union decline, and other factors as reasons for this. What we're going to talk primarily about today is sort of automation and the increasing role of capital being productive in the economy versus labor. And so Robert will talk about the theory of this. What I'm trying to do here is map out the trends, just so we have the data in our back pocket. Now this graph is really very important and really helps us think about what's going on. So I'll try and explain it as clearly as I can. So if you look at the four sort of shaded boxes on the bottom, you'll see different time periods. So 1979 to 89 is the black, and then on the far right you've got the period of 2007 to 2012. Now, so you see over these four sort of time periods how employment has changed. Now the graph is showing low-skilled service jobs to the left, highly paid, high-skilled jobs to the right, and then middle-skill income jobs in the middle. And what these data show is that there's a job polarization occurring. This is US data, and I'll show you data for other countries in a moment. What you're seeing is a minority, I believe, going up into the high, sort of upskilling or moving up into the highly paid, highly skilled area, but a majority having no choice but to get employment in the low-skilled service sector. Now, there's some very interesting work that was done by Katz and Kruger that looked at the sort of 10 million jobs that were created from 2005 to 2015, and they found that 94% of the employment growth, these 10 million jobs, in this time period fall into a category of alternative work. And so this is independent contractors, agency workers, on-call workers, contract workers. It's typically not the conventional full-time job, which is sort of disappearing in this more recent time period. Now, there's other data which allows us to look at family income. Now, if you look over the same time period, you see that the bottom percentile in terms of family income has been flat from the 60s through till 2016. And more interestingly, and I think more concerning, is the 50th percentile is also pretty much flat. What you're seeing is the high-skilled, high-wage earners pulling away from everybody else. And that's what this graph sort of represents. And you could argue that there's sort of a skill premium here driving the inequality in wage income, household income. Now here's the graph which takes the sort of more US-focused data but looks across 16 EU countries. Now what they've done in this graph is put the low-paying jobs in a category on the left of each country set of data. The middle-paying jobs are the black lines, and the high-paying jobs are the lines to the right of the black. So what you see here in every country, in these 16 EU countries that they looked at, is that you get this hollowing out of the middle class. So you're getting growth in high-paid jobs and growth in low-paying jobs. And that's the hollowing out of the middle class happening across industrialized economies. So that's, again, we've got to look at why that's happening, and I think binary economics helps us understand this in an interesting way. So another factor here is that if you think about the big picture of what I've presented so far, you have relatively flat earnings over the past several decades. But what's not flat is the cost of living. And just one example here is employee contributions to premiums, to family health care. What you're seeing is the cost of health care is rising over the past almost 20 years, but you have employee income at a much lower rate of growth. So even if your income is held steady, the cost of living, at least in the case of healthcare, is increasing. So you may feel poor because more of your income is going to survive, essentially, or have a good set of health coverage. And by the way, as you know, many people don't have health coverage in the US. It's in the millions of people that don't. Now, here's a headline from a piece of work that was put out by Oxfam around the Davos meeting, World Economic Forum meeting in Switzerland. And basically what they argue here is that 1% of the global population was able to capture 82% of the wealth created in 2018. So I'll say that again, 1% of the population has captured 82% of the wealth created. And so, this is a major problem. And if you think about what this means year on year, is you get a growing concentration of wealth, and it's basically through their ownership of capital that's enabling this to occur. And I'll let Robert speak a little bit more about these sort of dynamics in his presentation. So, bringing these two hockey stick curves together. So, one of the strands of my research is sustainable development. So, how has that idea evolved and changed over time? In 2012, we had the Rio Plus 20 conference. And an important mechanism that came out of that conference was the notion of the green economy. And the idea there was that you can deploy advanced science and technology to address the environmental problems that we're facing. You kind of decouple growth in environmental problems from growth in the economy. So that's the strategy of the green economy. Now, to do this, you deploy sort of hyper-efficient technologies, so you can have fewer inputs and have more output, essentially more of the goods and services you're producing, and less emissions and waste in the process. Now, if you reduce your inputs, it's not only the sort of raw materials that goes into these goods, typically, it's also labor. And so, if you're pursuing strategies to try and grow jobs and pursuing strategies to address environmental problems, potentially the effort to address environmental concerns could pull the rug out from underneath your efforts to create meaningful, well-paid jobs. And so this is what I think is one of the biggest problems that we are sort of embarking on. We're sort of addressing, we recognize these two environmental and inequality issues, but we're not necessarily connecting the solutions so that they will really combine. So having sort of thought about this for a while and become familiar with the work of Robert and others related to binary economics, we decided to sort of try and put together a proposal for the MacArthur 100 and Change grant, which is a $100 million grant, how you could transform the world. And we used this to really sort of pull our thinking together to think about, well, what would it look like if we were to try and implement a binary economics inspired solution. And so hopefully I'm going to try and play this little video here, which was a required part of the application. It's a 90-second video that tries to sort of give the essence of these ideas. And I'll play that, and then I'll say one more thing, and we'll pass over to Robert. So let's see if this works. The 21st century has brought about many innovations in technology, science, and medicine. But this progress has been accompanied by significant environmental problems. Also, too many people around the world still do not earn enough to meet, and the earning capacity of many workers is being eroded by technological advance. It's time for an innovative approach to these problems that does not require taxation, government borrowing, or redistribution. We need to share a sustainable future, a future where everyone can earn an income from labor and, increasingly, from capital. Our approach is based on the understanding that much productive capital is acquired with capital credit, repaid with the future earnings of capital. In fact, an important business strategy is to invest in new technology that pays for itself in future years. By broadly distributing its future earnings, capital will pay for itself far more profitably than if its earnings are concentrated in the hands of a few. By applying this approach to the economy worldwide, we will reverse growing inequality. Virginia Tech will convene a broad group of experts to develop the template economic and legal mechanisms that will enable all citizens of a country to earn capital income. These mechanisms will target the growth of inherently sustainable goods and services. During the second phase, we will share our solution with the world and select one or more developing countries willing to implement this innovative solution. We will then work with the selected partners to refine and implement their approach. With the funding available, we can lay the foundation for shared sustainable growth made achievable by enhanced earnings for everyone. So you can get a sense from that of how we're trying to pull together this notion of environmental challenges with a meaningful income. And what was interesting is that Dr. Virgil Wood, who had worked with Dr. Martin Luther King back in the 50s and 60s, saw that video and contacted me, which basically laid the foundation to what we're now calling the Beloved Community Initiative. And this series of webinars that we have now are our attempt to really now lay the foundation to think about what would a beloved community look like today, 50 years on from the loss of Dr. King, and what would potentially a beloved economy look like that supports a beloved community. And so that's sort of the broader context of why we are here today. And what I'm going to do now is share the presentation that Robert will give, and we'll transition over to that. So hopefully you can hear Robert now.
Use of capitalism, the ownership-broadening road to shared prosperity and sustainable growth. And one of the things I want to say is that even the great proponents of capitalism, I think, mostly agree that it has a defect, and the defect is that it leaves too many people behind. So we are about advancing a more inclusive form of capitalism. Now that term has been used in different ways for over a century. Sometimes it means stewardship, sometimes it means sustainability, sometimes it means taking into account the welfare of stakeholders, being better to employees, strengthening labor unions. But we have a very particular approach to inclusive capitalism, and it's captured by the following words. And if you move ahead with the next slide, what is inclusive capitalism? It's a capitalism that competitively includes all people in the process of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. And I think we have to underline that term, capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. If you've never heard that term before, it's something that is very important in the system. First of all, it's happening every moment. Every major corporation is acquiring capital with the earnings of capital. It's how almost all capital is acquired. Most capital is acquired with the earnings of capital, not with the earnings of labor. It is the essence of capitalism, and it was the economic basis of the Cold War. The Western nations were willing to go to nuclear war to defend the competitive right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. The essence of communism is outlawing the competitive right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. So it's important enough to go to the Cold War, to go to nuclear war over. Maybe it's important enough for the American people and the people in the UK and all the countries in the world to understand that everybody needs to be able to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. So it is the most important economic property right that people need but don't know they need. This is a public education process, teaching people the importance of the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. So here's some trouble with some realities. Dr. Hall has mentioned them before. First of all, economies have substantial unused capacity. They could make more of what they're making with lower unit costs in the long run if only people had the money to buy. Secondly, job polarization, the hollowing out of the middle class, we talked about that. Declining labor share of total income, we've seen that process. Dr. Hall showed it. And finally, in addition to that, we have increasing cost of living, growing wealth concentration. And if you look at the statistics in most countries, 1% of the population own 40 to 50% of the wealth. If you add that 1% to another 9%, you get 10%. That group owns 90% of the wealth and leaves 90% of the people scrambling for 10% of the wealth, and many of them have a negative net worth. Their liabilities are greater than their assets, unfortunately. So those are the troublesome realities. And at the same time, the problem is that although they're connected, the problem is not to a technological problem. We could make more of what everybody needs, more profit, but we can't do it profitably and sustainably in the present structure, which is concentrated wealth. So sustainability, that's one of the ice hockey sticks, and the earning capacity of people, they are connected. We need to find a way to profitably and sustainably provide the goods and services that people need and desire. And that requires effective demand, the demand to buy the products that could be made, but right now there's no demand for. Where does effective demand come from? Where does effective demand come from? Well, the economists have an answer for that, and it's a sound answer. It comes from earnings from production. One person's cost of producing, another person's income from producing. So the earnings in every time period provide the earning capacity to buy what's going to be sold in the next time period. Earnings from production. Also, it can come from some borrowing, use of credit, and it comes from monetizing. That's central bank issues, but we can leave those aside. Mainly, it's earnings from production. The question, in the age of the robots, as production becomes more capital intensive, how will we compensate people? The distribution of earnings must necessarily become more capital intensive if capital is going to distribute the earning capacity to buy what can be produced. So moving on, the purpose of production is consumption. Production and capital acquisition are forward-looking. This is an important principle. Present demand for labor and capital requires credit-worthy expectation of future demand. So think of a timeline. There's the eye looking to the future. It's when you see future effective demand for consumption that you will do what? You will raise the financial capital to invest in the real capital and labor to produce the goods and services to sell them. So it requires a forward look to the effective distribution of future demand for goods and services. That's the way capitalism works in the long run. That's the jet stream of capitalism. So moving on, to achieve fuller employment, economics has an idea, and it's either austerity or stimulus, If you say, how do we get more goods and services? The right wing says we need austerity, and accept that we need to reduce taxes, which is a stimulus strategy. And the left wing says we need to stimulate the economy, but the market doesn't distribute sufficient demand, so the government is needed to provide the surrogate for the eroding earning capacity of people. Those are the two. And they agree, though, and on wonderful things, although they have those differences. First of all, they agree that the economy is not working at full capacity. Each one has a prescription different from the other for achieving it. Not working at full efficiency, not realizing its full growth potential. So there's a remarkable agreement. They agree that fuller employment requires widespread demand for consumer goods. In other words, mass production requires mass consumption. Well, how are the masses going to earn? Labor is going out of style. It's claiming a decreasing claim on the total wealth, so we need to broaden capital acquisition. There's another principle of fuller employment beyond austerity and stimulus, and that's what Dr. Hall and I are talking about. Here is the principle. It's a little bit wordy, but it's worth memorizing. A broader distribution of capital acquisition, creates the rational expectation of more broadly distributed capital income to people with a higher marginal spending rate, that is, a greater propensity to consume in future years, and therefore greater demand for fuller employment of capital and labor in earlier years. That is called the principle of binary growth. I want to pause on that for a moment. That is a new idea in the history of economic thought and the history of human thought, in the sense that before 1958, no thinker in philosophy, economics, science advanced that idea either implicitly or explicitly. So it's a little bit like Newton's laws, force equals mass times acceleration. Before Newton advanced that, nobody had thought of that. And this is a new idea. It was first advanced implicitly and only seldom explicitly by Louis Kelso. And this is the basis of our work, capturing this idea that rose and fell in the last century and was not recognized. It's the principle of binary growth that has huge implications. The capital that buys itself for the rich can buy itself more profitably and more sustainably if everybody's included in the capital acquisition process. So instead of focusing on jobs and welfare for the poor and the means to support them, it's much better to open the process of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. And all three can be done. You don't have to abandon a higher wage strategy. You don't have to abandon a greater welfare strategy. And you don't have to abandon a stimulate growth strategy to broaden capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. It doesn't require anything but opening the same system that works for the rich to work for the middle class and the poor. So let's move on. Let's move on to the next slide. At present, capital acquisition is highly concentrated and therefore fails to distribute the capital earnings needed to purchase its output and therefore make more production profit. That's simply a restatement of the principle of binary growth. What do we mean by capital? Real capital, sometimes called just capital, it's land, machines, tools, structures, machines, patents, trademarks, other intangibles, anything capable of being owned and employed in production. That's different from financial capital. Financial capital is real capital minus liabilities. It's after the real capital has satisfied liabilities that you get financial capital. Financial capital is a claim on the real capital and its revenues after antecedent liabilities have been satisfied. So we have to distinguish between real capital and financial capital, which is the stocks and bonds that corporations issue. Real capital does work according to the binary economic principles. Financial capital does not work, although it can be used to hire real capital and labor to do work. Moving on. What is the cause of per capita growth? Adam Smith thought it was labor specialization. Modern economics thought it was increasing productivity. Primarily, the role of advancing technology reflected in capital is to increase productivity, primarily labor productivity. So we have a graph that looks like this. If you zoom in on that, you see growth is 30% capital productivity and 70% labor productivity. That reflects historically until the last 10 years, labor's claim on total income and capital's claim on total income. And capital here includes both dividends and interest. So labor was for a long time claiming 70% of the total income, but that has been declining. And we need to understand why, and we need to remedy that with a greater infusion of capital income from poor and middle class people. We have another way of looking at the Industrial Revolution. Instead of you haul a sack, you saw 10 boards an hour with a hand saw, 100 boards an hour with a machine saw. We think of capital making labor more productive. But look at it from the point of view of hauling sacks. You haul a sack a mile and you're exhausted. You put 10 sacks on a horse and go twice as far in half the time. Or you put 10,000 sacks on a truck. The role of the capital is not simply to make the labor more productive. The role of the capital is to do ever more of the work. And although right now it takes a driver to drive the truck, not for long, because we're going to see driverless trucks coming in too. So what will we do in the age of automation? So this shows you that there's another way of looking at growth. It's not increasing labor productivity. It's the increasing work done by capital. You go from 1 sack miles to 10 sack miles to 10,000 sack miles. At this point, you've squeezed almost all labor out of production. The process of technological advance is to shift work from labor to capital. That's why labor's claim on total production is decreasing over time. So we have a different concept of growing per capita growth. The bottom line, you see labor productivity. We're not really working any harder than we were in the Stone Age. In fact, we're probably working less hard. And then, of course, there's things that you can't be owned, like the sun, the wind, that they can own. The biggest worker on Earth, by the way, is the sun, but you can't own the sun. And then there's capital productivity, starting at the Stone Age and growing with the Industrial Revolution. Until today, if you look at the way things are made compared to Adam Smith's time in 1776, the binary economist believes that most work is done by capital, not by labor, and that we are increasingly squeezing labor out of production with every technological advance. So if we move ahead now, we have two different concepts. Productivity, which is the mainstream economic concept, the value of all work done by all factors of production, by one denominator, usually labor productivity we focus on. Notice that productivity can increase while the work done by labor decreases. You're squeezing labor out of production, you're getting more output, but you're using more productive capital, and we think that labor productivity is increasing. It's only a ratio. Ratios don't do work. Productiveness is the better concept to show you what's going on. Retroactively, it means work done. Prospectively, it means productive capacity. Productive capacity. So that our graph looks different. Now, that leads to, and this is something that economists will appreciate, maybe others can glaze over these two slides. There are two theories of price and value. The conventional view started with Adam Smith that things are worth the work people are willing to do to acquire them. How much work do you want to do? How much do you want something? Well, how much work are you willing to do? Think of it in modern terms of a family whose income is not enough to give them a vacation in the Bahamas. But if they work overtime, they may be able to afford to go to the Bahamas. Well, what's it worth to go to the Bahamas? That will tell you how much overtime they're willing to do. Other people may want to go to Las Vegas and gamble. Others may want to go to the museums in Lucerne. Whatever they're willing to do, the extra work is their bid to do work. And, of course, the employer will choose the one that operates the most efficiently and creates the value ones. But the binary view is that things are worth the people are willing to do themselves and or the work they're willing to employ their capital to do to acquire. Think of a job of hauling a sack from A to C. You want to get it from A to C, but you're only willing to do the work to get it from A to B. Well, that's all you're going to get out of that. It's the work you're willing to do. And you express your value and do your work accordingly. But if you own a horse, it's not simply the work you're willing to do, it's the work you're willing to employ your horse to do. So the employment of capital, when broadly distributed to provide earning capacity for more people, will have a greater earning capacity. People can express their value in that, and the work will be done, and the income will be earned, distributed as people expect to purchase its output. So, the earning capacity, the rate of return on capital also has a different look. The conventional view is the willingness of people to work at a given wage. That's the work it takes to employ the capital. The scarcity of capital. When capital is first invented, first owned, and there's not much of it, it has a high value. But if you get out to the margin when you're theoretically at full capacity, the capital won't produce anymore because people don't want it anymore. It's worthless. You can leave it on the ground, nobody will steal it, and there's no point in hiring somebody to do it. So that's the conventional view. But the binary view is that the earning capacity of capital is also a function of the distribution of capital acquisition. As the distribution of capital acquisition broadens, its earning capacity increases because it distributes more effective demand. That's the concept. Okay, so we move on. Capital has 6 powers. We don't normally think of them. If we can replace labor, it can vastly supplement labor. It can do work that labor alone can never do. It can work without labor. It can pay for itself out of its future income, and it can distribute income to purchase its production. And each of those are important powers. We talk about capital substitution for labor, but it's almost a misnomer. Anytime you use capital to do what labor once did, you get vastly increased productive power. What do we mean by do work? that labor alone can never do. You know, I read an article that said that farmers have grown 10% more apples this year. Farmers never grew an apple. Only an apple tree can grow an apple. We marvel at the computer revolution, but we can't make a single computer chip because our hands too big. Only machines that we guide, the chemicals that we guide processes can do that. Some of you may have ridden up an elevator 10 stories. You couldn't get the lifting power of if you had slaved all the people around you to do the work of that elevator. It can work without labor. If you don't think capital does work, try living without your washing machine and try carrying the water on a jug on your head the way women have to do in some capital poor countries, rather than turning on a faucet. And of course, pay for itself under the promise of its future earning. That's the logic of business in a modern economy. And one person's expense in producing yields another person's income. That's a principle that exists in all losses, all expenses, except of course casualty losses, which are handled with insurance. And we will deal with the question of insurance very shortly. So those are the 6 wealth-enhancing powers, growth-enhancing powers of capital, and they're greater if they're more broadly distributed. So, the primary role of technology, the mainstream view is to increase productivity, mainly labor productivity. The binary view is to increase capital productiveness. The primary role of capital is to increase labor productivity, to increase growth. The primary role of capital in the binary view is to do ever more of the work and distribute ever more of the income. So capital is not only immensely more productive than labor, it has the capacity to distribute income far, far greater than labor has. Labor has a declining percentage. When you shift work from labor to capital, labor's claim on total production must decrease. It's a simple arithmetic relationship. So we can summarize binary economics with 3 propositions. Labor and capital both do work. They're equally fundamental, independent variables or binary factors of production. If you want a sack from A to B, you don't really care whether it's hauled by a person or by a horse or by a truck. It's all the same work. Because capital does the same work that labor can do and work that labor can never do. We think of technology making labor more productive. People could graduate from school saying that that's true. But the more important fact is that technology makes capital much more productive than labor in task after task after task, which is why we shift the work from labor to capital and get vastly more productive power. And third is the principle of binary growth. A broader distribution of capital acquisition. Now I've added with the earnings of capital. Why? Because the earnings of labor aren't enough to support much life. The earnings of except for really elite jobs, it's the earnings of capital that is productive enough to acquire capital. Acquire capital. It promises greater consumer demand in future years, and therefore greater demand for full employment of capital and labor in early years. The principle of binary growth. I want to pause for a minute and say, if you listen to the Parliament debate and you listen to the debate in Congress, everybody wants fuller employment. Everybody wants to help the earning capacity of poor and working people. Everybody wants greater growth, sustainable growth. When have you ever heard anybody say, well, the way to do that is we ought to broaden capital acquisition with the earnings of capital? It's not on the lips of any congressman, any parliamentarian, and it should be. And leadership is needed to teach this very fundamental principle for a more inclusive capitalism. Okay. Now, in the time that I have spoken thus far, I oftentimes speak at Hilton hotels, so poor Paris Hilton is my poster child. She has acquired more capital with the earnings of capital while asleep than most people earn in their lifetimes. How does she do this? Now we move to the implementation stage if we understand the principles of binary economics. Well, she's used the institutions of corporate finance, corporations, fiduciaries, lenders, and financial risk credit insurers. Those are the 4 institutions she's used. How do corporations earn money? Well, that's an interesting question. First of all, they have to, in the short run, They have to earn revenues in excess of operating and financial costs. That's how they earn a profit. But in the long run, they have to do that and maintain or increase their market share. And maintaining and increasing a market share to meet future demand requires a long-run capital acquisition plan. That's the key. Otherwise, you're going to lose money. If you don't grow enough to meet future demand, you're not going to be able to maintain your share. And if you overinvest, you're going to have waste. So, I'm going to shift gears for just a moment and talk about credit. We all know how people use mortgages to acquire homes. A lender will loan money to a person for a promissory note, cash to the owner, title goes to the home buyer. And if it pays for the loan in 20 or 30 years, the home is now fully owned by the home buyer. And that's the way that works. It's credit over time. Purchasing an apartment building is very similar, but there's an important difference. The note, cash, the entrepreneur invests the cash in the apartment building. The rents from future income are paid, distributed to the owner, and the owner repays the lender and retrieves the note. So once the note has been repaid, the future rent becomes income stream to the owner. That's buying an apartment building. Now, there's an important difference between those two. What is the difference? The difference is that with the home loan, labor income repays the loan for most people. In the capital apartment building, what's the difference? It's capital that replays the loan. You're acquiring capital with the earnings of capital. Well, an apartment building is a little bit risky, and it would take the banker, the lender would probably insist on a personal guarantee. But a company that owns 10,000 units, diversified risk all over the country, would be much easier, and there would be no personal guarantee. And if you can imagine a diversified portfolio in America's 3,000 largest companies, that's the Russell Index, or the 350 companies in Britain, in the UK that comprise the FTSE 350, you have really the most investable asset over time that is known in society. So that's the difference between the two. So when you move ahead to the next slide, here's a corporation now. As you can imagine, all 3,000 American or 350 FTSE corporations, they acquire capital 70% with retained earnings, and that 70% comes from a profit and loss statement. Corporations have revenues, they have operating expenses, which paying the labor and other expenses, financial expenses, that's interest. They have profit before taxes. There's some taxes that are paid, profit after taxes. Some dividends may be distributed, and then retained earnings. And that retained earnings is what provides 70% capital acquisition to all publicly traded companies in America and the UK, about 70% plus. Then there's another 25+% that comes from borrowed money. How does that work? This little commercial lender, note to cash, just the same before cash goes out and the capital assets are acquired. That's the way the corporation increases more productive capacity in the long run. The plan grows, pays for itself out of future profits, and then the note is returned. So 25% plus done this way, 75% done that way. So Paris Hilton shares reflect the increased value of this wealth. All the way, by the way, she's sleeping right now. She's not doing anything. She may be active in other affairs and earning money from labor, but that's how she's earning from capital. She's acquired capital, retained earnings of capital, and borrowed money, future earnings of capital, with non-recourse credit as to her, meaning to say, if the corporation fails to pay the loan, the corporation's on the hook, and the value of the shares may decrease, and she may lose her investment, but there's no further recourse to her. There's no risk to her beyond the investment that she's made. So that's how Paris Hilton does it. Now, Paris can also acquire shares with borrowed money. She could either buy shares, or she could use a lender to borrow money to buy the shares and repay the loan out of the capital income that she has. And if she wants not to borrow the money directly, if she wants not to encumber her assets, because lenders need two sources of repayment, she could purchase what's called capital credit insurance. It's a concept not widely known, but AIG was a capital credit insurer. We didn't let it go bankrupt. We revived it in the great financial crisis. Lloyd's of London was a capital credit insurer. Capital credit insurance is available. Banks sometimes syndicate together to spread the risk. Sometimes there are private insurers that for a fee take a portion of the interest payments and incur a liability to cover the bank in the event of a loss. And that process goes on. Now, if that process goes on and the corporation takes the cash, acquires a capital asset to plan growth, the dividends repay the loan, that process is how corporations acquire capital, either with retained earnings, borrowed money, with a sale of stock, all three of which are essentially acquired with the earnings of capital. And what that does is create an earning capacity. If it's done every year, we see a graph off to the right. You see a graph off to the right. That assumes a capital cost recovery period of 7 years. So if in the first year the corporation has bought a portion of its capital in these three ways, then in the 8th year, that first year annual acquisition is fully paid for itself and is now pumping a rate of return to Paris. Just like if she had bought an apartment building and it paid for itself in 7 years, in the 8th year, it would be pumping a return. If the corporation does it in the 2nd year, then in the 9th year, 2 years worth of capital will pay for itself. By the time you get to the 14th year, 7 years of capital acquisition will have paid for themselves. That's the 50% mark. 21 years, 2/3. 28, 75%. That's what they call a logarithmic curve. In the long run, it matches the additional earning capacity of capital with the earning capacity to purchase what is produced. But as long as Paris is the owner, the income will not be distributed to people who will acquire its output. The chances are, with her net worth, if Paris Hilton captures a significant amount of new corporate wealth, she will not spend it more on production than on consumption. My guess is that she has already met her consumer needs 10 or 20 or 30 times over. The rich, the super rich, don't spend more when they acquire capital with the earnings of capital. They look for investment, but in the context of weaker consumer demand than would exist if you broadened ownership. But the fiduciary trust, just as it works for Paris while she sleeps, could work for employees, customers, neighbors, and welfare recipients. The same process of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital, acquiring capital on credit, and amortizing the credit, repaying the credit with future earnings, could be extended to all people. With the very same institutions that routinely make it available to the wealthier people. So that process would create consumers, better consumers than the employees, better consumers than the customers, and the neighbors, people who live around company plants and company towns. And the same growing earning capacity would be distributed to poor and middle-class people. And if you remember our notion of the effective consumer demand is going to be increasing starting in year 7, 8, and 9, and 10, steadily increasing, which means you have to begin investing more in earlier years to maintain your market share as a corporation, because if you don't do it, your competitor will, and you will lose market share, and your rate of return will go down, and shareholders will abandon your company in favor of your competitor. So that process is simply an articulation in specific terms of the principle of binary growth. That process is what we call inclusive corporate finance, If used by the Russell 3000 or the FTSE 350, consequences of that would be growing consumer demand for the products. If you move to the next slide, we can get some articulation of that. If members of the poor middle class are unable to acquire, they would bring to the bargaining table a chip not possessed by existing owners. After the acquisition debt has been satisfied, they will create more production-based consumer demand. If conventionally acquired, most of the capital earners would seek investment opportunities, put in the context of weaker prospective consumer demand. That's the principle of binary growth. Now, some other consequences do result from this. Think about, if we move to the next slide, well, I guess the barriers to broader ownership, therefore, are simply the implementation of a more inclusive capitalism. It's not an institutional problem. All the corporations in place are there. These institutions function very well for people, but they'll function even better if more people are included in the process. Now, I did want to go back for a minute, maybe perhaps to the preceding slide, or to comment that as employees and customers, neighbors, and welfare recipients are capitalized, think of the welfare recipients, they would be able to earn from capital income. You could spin them off welfare to get $1 or £1 worth of capital income. You can take them 50 cents or 50p off the welfare rolls and give the corporation whose capital earned that credit a tax credit. And if employees, customers, and neighbors that are in a taxable bracket begin earning more income, you can raise greater revenues with the same tax rates, the same tax revenues with lower tax rates, and since you're spinning people off welfare, you can even lower tax rates further. You could provide universal tax reduction, spinning people off welfare, and increase the consumer demand. Why? Because you're distributing the vast and increasing earning capacity of capital more broadly. So with this in mind, we could think about having a board of directors meeting of America's 3,000 largest companies with a FTSE 350. And if we have a planned acquisition plan, we could use retained earnings, or we could use borrowed money. That would be fine. But we also could sell stock. And if a couple of things about the corporation that many people don't fully understand, and that is that when you ask who owns the corporation, many people say the shareholders. Well, you know, as a matter of law, that's not true. The shareholders own securities issued by the corporation. But nobody owns the corporation. The corporation is a separate entity. And it has the capacity to make contracts and borrow money over the long term and centralize its management and hold on to its revenues independent of the will of the shareholders. All they can do is vote in other directors, but they can't command the earning capacity of the distribution of the earnings of the corporation except when it's dissolved. So we could sell stock, and if Bill Gates knocks on the door and says, sell me stock and I'll bring you a synergy gain with Microsoft, because I know your company would do well if I were a stockholder and I would bring you special deals, we would have to look at whether we should sell stock to Bill Gates rather than use retained earnings or borrowed money. And if Warren Buffett came in and said, well, sell me stock because I'll bring you a synergy gain with Berkshire Hathaway, and both of them say, by the way, if you don't sell me stock, I'll go to your competitor and I'll bring the synergy gains to them. Well, we'd be hard-pressed to turn that down if it turns out that those are real values. Well, if Dr. Hall comes to the board and says, I represent the synergy gain that Bill, Warren can't give you, and that is I represent the vast earning capacity of your customers, neighbors, employees, and welfare recipients, bringing you tax credits and reduced tax rates. That's a synergy gain we'd have to consider too. And if it's big, as we believe it is, because we think capital is doing most of the work and distributing most of the income, then the directors would be inherently interested and have the fiduciary duty to enhance corporate wealth. Remember, the duty of the directors is to enhance corporate wealth, not shareholder wealth. Shareholders don't have a coherent time frame in which to decide whether they want dividends or retained earnings. That's an individual decision, and the lender would never loan if he had to make all the shareholders happy. It's maximizing corporate wealth. So there's a natural inclination and a natural duty of corporations through their fiduciaries to broaden their capital ownership. All that we need to get this off the ground is not a mandate. You don't have to force this. All you have to do is teach people three simple principles. Capital and labor both do work. Technology makes capital much more productive than labor. And a broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital promises an immense growth in productive capacity. A green growth, by the way, in productive capacity, because greener growth can be financed the more broadly capital is acquired. A greener growth. All that we have to do is teach these principles. First to our citizens, to our economists, and to our parliamentarians, to our congressmen, because this principle will provide a new and more important form of inclusive capitalism. So I think maybe we should try to open it to to questions. There is what we call a collective action problem. The first corporation that does this won't capture the gains, but a group of corporations cooperating together can capture these gains. And we can perhaps talk about that in the question and answer period.
Well, I guess one sort of thought that I had was in terms of the sustainability dimension. So the approach that you've articulated here can address potentially the income inequality trends that I presented earlier. And one of the thoughts that I had was, how you might target the future growth using this mechanism. So you might, for example, have an approach which targets inherently sustainable goods and services. So companies that want to invest in those could finance their growth this way. I know we've spoken in the past about other options, and perhaps you could just say a few words about your view on how we might stimulate sort of what you could call as a green economy using this approach.
Certainly, I'd be happy to do that. I think the first principle to understand is that the opportunity to broaden capital acquisition with the earnings of capital is not a substitute for other policies. It can be done while we pursue all other policies. So a green economy policy would become more affordable. Let's look at how it might become more affordable. First of all, we've talked about unutilized productive capacity. That reflects my view and the view of binary economists that the present industrial economies could produce more of what people need and desire at lower unit costs if only people had the money to buy. In other words, the reason that Economics 101 teaches that producers don't produce more, which is that the revenues have now been exceeded by the costs. The reason that's not what has happened. What's happening is that there are no more revenues, so people have no more earning capacity. But if they had earning capacity, you could actually produce at lower unit costs. So we have unused capacity. We could make more food, clothing, shelter, transportation, communication, but people don't have the money to buy. Now, in the context of the green economy, you can look at the issue of brown versus green production in two ways. You can say, well, some of it is fixable by a technological fix. But the technological fix is one that people cannot afford. If, for example, right now, solar energy is not as competitive as it might otherwise be. Suppose you multiply the earning capacity of the common person by 2 or 3. Solar energy becomes affordable. So one of the ways of handling the green issue is just to recognize that a goodly number of processes for which there is an unutilized productive capacity in the form of a fix that people cannot afford will become fixable. Then there are those things for which there is no technological fix. Well, for those, you're going to have to put, for one alternative, is to put restrictions. And I believe if you look at the politics of that, the ecological movement is a middle-class movement. It's harder to argue for ecological concerns to people who are starving to death, and they want more growth. So you're going to have a growing population of people who will find ecological problems more politically desirable and sustainable. You will reduce the idea that someone says, well, we got to use the Brown process because I need a job. You reduce that tension. That's the third one. And the fourth one, which is what you mentioned, one can use this prospect of growth and the government's ability to sweeten it, and we haven't talked about that. There are mechanisms by providing government reinsurance. We talked about capital credit insurance on the private level. I think private capital credit insurance is entirely viable given the great productive capacity of capital. But it would be more viable the bigger that you increase the insurance pool. Well, the largest insurance pool, it would be a government reinsurance program, which might or might not be linked to the full faith and credit. Not every government insurance program is backed by the full faith and credit, so it may or may not be an ultimate risk to the taxpayer. But you could do that. And another thing we haven't talked about, Louis Kelso always proposed it, and it gets a little bit harder to understand. You could monetize capital acquisition, which brings down financial costs down to the banker spread a couple of percent. It brings down, and then the capital credit insurance, which if you do J insurance, which has always been profitable, except in a couple of periods of fraud and dereliction of duty, 2%, 3 or 4%, and the cost of the Federal Reserve and monetizing, you got 5% financial capital. That's an attractive rate for many companies that otherwise, in a higher interest rate environment, might be borrowing at 6%. You could make that especially available to green processes, and you could even provide that the green processes are the ones that would be the ones that would get priority over this. So all of that is doable. There's decisions to be made, political trade-offs, but the legislatures and the parliaments are not going to get involved in those what I call second-order questions until they recognize that there's a mega solution to the big problem, and that is the problem of enabling people to afford what can be produced by broadening capital acquisition of the earth capital. That's the mega problem. And then you're fighting over the details when you talk about how to implement.
Thank you, Robert. We have a number of attendees on the phone. Unfortunately, in that setup, they can't ask questions, but we do have a couple of participants that could ask questions if they wanted to, and we have a Q&A chat way to do that. And you can also press the button to put your hand up, and we can allow you to ask questions. So if you do have any questions, now is your chance. While I wait to see if I hear from anyone, one sort of comment I wanted to make is about where we might go from here. We have sort of a growing number of people who are interested in these ideas. I think I would characterize what we would like to do is in two sort of areas. One is looking at the theory and trying to develop perhaps some empirical models based around that. That's one space. And the other space is the what-if scenario space. That's how I would characterize it. So, what would it look like if we were to implement these ideas, and how many firms would be needed? And so I think what I've seen in talking with people is this natural progression where once they understand the basic ideas, the next step is show me some numbers, show me some empirical analysis on this. So we're beginning to find individuals who are potentially interested in working with us on those types of projects. So if you're watching this and you have an interest in those kinds of ideas and that type of analysis, please do reach out and contact me. At this point, Robert, I don't see any questions coming in, so I wanted to let you have a chance to say anything else that comes to mind that you wanted to touch on before we bring this to a close.
Well, I think the biggest unexplored question, if we were going to have this board meeting, would be to deal with what we would call the collective action problem, and we could talk about that just a little bit. If we were, let's say, Company N in the Russell 3000 or Company N in the FTSE 350, we have this capital acquisition plan. We're convinced that a broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earning capital will create more earning capacity down the road, and so that will make better customers, and that better customers mean easier business. But we're not going to capture that gain. Let's say we make cars and automobiles, and down the road we capitalize our employees, our neighbors, that is to say people who live in our company towns where we're the major employer, or people who live in the poor areas around our factories, and we capitalize welfare recipients, so we have the possibility of getting tax deduction, tax credits for the relief from welfare that our capital is providing. But still, down the road, those people, employees, customers, neighbors, and welfare, they may have, first of all, they're probably going to buy more food, clothing, and shelter before they buy our cars. And free markets as they are, they're going to say, well, suppose they want to buy a competitor's car. We can't force them to buy our car. How do you solve that problem? Well, one way of solving that problem is, first of all, to persuade the manufacturers of not just cars, but a number of them now. And in the USA, we have the National Association of Manufacturers. And that means the producers of food, clothing, shelter, transportation, communication, healthcare, entertainment. Those are about what people spend their money on. If we got just one or two producers in those fields to go along with us, well, now we have a group of people, a group of producers who potentially could, first of all, mutualize the shares that they own. So that means that our employees would have, let's say, 50% of their shares in our specific company stock. That would increase their allegiance to the company. But the other 50% of the diversified portfolio of all these others. And now, if we could just get the legislature to do one very simple thing. We are repaying the loans that enable the trust to buy the shares for the employees, customers, neighbors, welfare. We're repaying the loan with dividends. That needs to be cash. But once the dividends have repaid the loans, we now have a corporate income from all these participating companies. Let's make it payable in a script that is only usable for the ownership-broadening companies. So our employees might get script down the road. Well, some of them might buy it on food, but others that are the owners of, let's say, stock of food companies, they may have a full appetite of food already satisfied. They say, well, I want to use it to buy a car. You can capture the gain by having the dividends repayable in script, and once they're tendered to the producers, then the producer can turn that into cash. Now, would there still be some customers, some neighbors, customers, employees who want to buy some other product? Sure, but they could sell their shares to somebody who wants to buy the products of the ownership-broadening companies. So you could increase the capture of this gain. In my own view, and this is a political judgment, think about the airlines, maybe it was United, one of those companies that dragged the poor Chinese doctor off the plane because bumped him, and now they pay $10,000. There's a lot of response to public pressure. Think about the companies that are now abandoning the policies with respect to things like the NRA, or championing them because of their belief of the public pressure. Companies are very sensitive these days to public pressure, particularly companies that have a mass production consumer base. Imagine two different companies we're approaching with the car manufacturer. We go to the food manufacturers and say, will you join us in ownership broadening? One company says, yes, we'd love to. That's very socially conscious. What about the competitive position of the companies? Says, no, we refuse to do that. We want to enrich the 1%. If these ideas become widely understood, there's a potency to them. A potency to them that could make this thing very achievable. The first issue is public education, to my view. And I know that it's good to have academics wanting to do the projections, and it's good to do the what-ifs. That's fine for the academics. We give them something to do. I think they'll learn lots of important things. But frankly, I think there's enough in these principles to already go public with it. I think the problem is that the legislatures don't understand it, and the interest groups don't understand it. If Martin Luther King had lived, and if Virgil Wood had succeeded as he tried to get Martin Luther King behind this idea, and if he had embraced what was then called binary economics, but I think is more aptly called inclusive capitalism, if the African American leaders of our country that have visibility in public affairs were to begin saying, we want capital acquisition with the earnings of capital, not just for the minority people, not just for the people of color, but for everybody. Well, the first thing is you would be subscribing to Martin Luther King's view that you're not going to solve the race problem until you solve the economic problem. That's debatable, but I think he had something there. And I think it's also true, by the way, even if we solve the economic problem, there'd still be a race problem, because some people still work with hate and racism, even though it's against their economic interests. It's a separate problem. But I can tell you that without the projections and without the what-ifs, if several political constituencies like the Black Caucus in Congress got behind this idea, and others, the progressive Democrats and the conservative Republicans that truly believe in a capitalism for everybody, uniting the best of the left and the right. This idea doesn't need proof. There's enough common sense behind it, I think, for it to take off. What is needed is leadership. Virginia Tech does not have to do its projections in order for it to teach its students that technology makes capital more productive than labor in task after task after task. Virginia Tech doesn't need what if, or North Syracuse University, for example, to graduate economists that understand that there are three theories of fuller employment: stimulus, austerity, and broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. The ideas are ripe for teaching, and that's what I think is the next step, much more so than anything else. Although I'd be happy to work with the projection people and happy to work with the what-if people.
Thank you, Robert. I think, as I was listening to your way of sort of explaining the collective action problem and the strategies that are out there, I mean, those are the implementing an analysis of what these strategies could do in an empirical sense, I think would be an important learning tool. So I sort of see it actually as part of the learning process. When students get to a certain point, you capture their attention, and then the next question is, let's think about how impactful this could be. So I think at this point we will. I don't see any questions coming in, so I'll bring the webinar to a close, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us today and joining this Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Jubilee Summit. And I appreciate those who have listened in and those who are watching now this recording. Please do reach out to Robert or I if you have any questions or comments. We view this as an opportunity to start a broad dialogue on these ideas. So at that point, I'll say thanks to everybody and good day.
Thank you.